There is a moment that many people in their 60s know without ever having given it a name. The phone is in their hand. A name is on the screen, someone they have known for 30 years, someone they once called without thinking twice. And they stop. They look at the name for a few seconds. Then they put the phone down, go back to whatever they were doing, and tell themselves they will call later. Later comes. They don't call. This happens more often than most people in this generation would admit. Not because they have stopped caring, not because the friendship has ended or gone cold, but because something quieter and harder to locate gets in the way, something that has been building for a long time and has very little to do with the friend on the other end of that undialed call. If you recognize that moment, this is not a video about why you are doing something wrong. It is a video about where that hesitation actually comes from, because it didn't start with the phone. It started decades earlier, in the way a generation was shaped to move through the world, and understanding that shaping explains far more than any simple answer about aging or busy schedules ever could. From the outside, the pattern looks straightforward. Baby boomers grow older, their social circles shrink, they become more private, more self-contained. Adult children wonder why their parent seems less connected than they used to be. Friends on the other side of the silence wonder what they did wrong. The easy explanations get reached for quickly. They are getting older. They are set in their ways. They prefer their own company now. Some people just pull back as they age. But those explanations miss something essential. They describe the surface behavior without asking what is underneath it. And what is underneath it is not indifference, and it is not the natural consequence of growing older. It is a learned response, learned early, reinforced for decades, and now operating quietly in the background of every phone that gets picked up and put down without a call being made. The real question is not whether baby boomers are withdrawing from friendship. The real question is what they were taught, without anyone ever sitting them down and teaching it directly about what it means to reach out and need someone. To understand that, you have to go back to where this generation's psychology was formed, not to the nostalgia version of the past, the backyard barbecues and the neighborhood streets and the uncomplicated community that gets remembered fondly, to the actual texture of how life worked in those households, in those decades, and what a child absorbed simply from watching the adults around them. For most people born between the mid-1940s and the early 1960s, emotional life was managed privately. This wasn't cruelty. It wasn't a philosophy anyone articulated. It was simply the unspoken agreement of the time. Difficulties were not aired in front of others. Emotional weight was not placed on the people around you. You handled what needed handling, and you did it without making too much of it. The praise went to the capable child, the reliable one, the one who figured things out without being asked twice. The discomfort appeared whenever someone expressed need too openly, too visibly, too much. Adults changed the subject. Conversations pivoted. The unspoken lesson arrived without a single word being spoken. Needing people too openly is a burden, and being a burden is something to be avoided. A generation internalized that lesson thoroughly, not because they were easily shaped, but because children absorb what they live inside, and what they lived inside consistently rewarded self-sufficiency and quietly penalized visible need. That formation produced something real and lasting, people who could be counted on in a crisis, people who showed up, who absorbed difficulty without broadcasting it, who became the steady center of families and workplaces and communities for decades. That steadiness was not accidental. It was built carefully and early, out of the specific conditions of that upbringing. The strength was genuine. It just came with a cost that wouldn't become visible for another 40 years. Then the 1970s arrived. And if there was ever a decade designed to confirm what that generation had already been quietly learning, it was that one. Toplast. The economy that had hummed steadily through their childhoods began to buckle. Inflation ate into household budgets in ways families felt every week at the grocery store. Fathers who had expected their careers to be stable found the ground shifting underneath them. The post-war sense that things would simply keep getting better, that the promise made to this generation would be delivered as advertised, began to crack visibly. Divorce rates in America doubled during the 1970s. For millions of children and young teenagers in this generation, that statistic was not an abstraction. It was their own house, their own parents, their own sudden need to navigate a world that had reorganized itself around them without asking permission. Many came home from school to empty houses for the first time, not because of anyone's choice, but because economic pressure now required both parents to work, and the infrastructure to support children during those hours simply did not exist yet. Olive's 12-year-old in that situation figures out the afternoon alone, makes decisions about what to eat, what to do, how to fill the hours. Nobody calls to check in, nobody asks what happened at school, and the lesson that had been introduced at home is now confirmed by circumstance. You are the one responsible for yourself. Waiting for someone to show up is less reliable than simply not needing them to. That is not a cynical conclusion for a child living it. It is a practical one. It is survival intelligence, earned through direct experience, and it worked genuinely and consistently for a very long time. But survival intelligence does not retire when the circumstances that produced it change. It becomes the default setting, the operating system running quietly underneath everything else, long after the original conditions that required it have passed. Friendship after 60 runs directly into that default setting, because here is what changes structurally when this generation reaches retirement age. The scaffolding that held social life together for decades quietly disappears. For 30 or 40 years, friendships had containers. Work provided daily contact with the same people. Children's school activities put parents in regular proximity. Neighborhoods had rhythms, the same faces at the same times, relationships that maintained themselves because the circumstances kept producing them. No one had to decide to maintain a friendship with a colleague they saw every single day. The friendship existed inside the structure, and the structure did most of the work. Retirement dismantles that structure entirely, and what it asks for in return is something that does not come naturally to people whose emotional wiring was built around self-sufficiency, deliberate, openly expressed reaching out, the willingness to say, without any practical reason, without any shared problem to solve or information to exchange, I was thinking about you, I miss you, let's find time. For many baby boomers, that specific act, initiating contact purely out of affection, with no functional pretext to hide behind, requires a kind of emotional exposure they were never trained to be comfortable with. The feeling is there, the wanting is entirely real, but the language for expressing it, the ease and the habit of expressing it, was never built into the foundation. And in its absence, the phone gets picked up, the name gets found, and a question arrives that is small but somehow enough to end the attempt. What would I even say? Poplast bikaf. This is not laziness. It is not the friendship mattering less. It is a very specific mismatch between what this stage of life requires and what this generation was equipped to give. Poplast bikaf. There is another layer underneath this, one that rarely gets named because it doesn't feel like fear. It feels like wisdom, like realistic assessment, like simply learning from experience. But what it actually represents for many people in this generation is the accumulated weight of small disappointments that were never spoken out loud. A call made once that wasn't returned for 2 weeks. A plan suggested that somehow never materialized. A difficult moment shared that was met with a pivot toward easier conversation. Showing up for someone during a hard time and noticing months later that the reciprocity wasn't quite there. None of these were betrayals. None of them were significant enough to name as a grievance. but they settled somewhere in the quiet ledger that the mind keeps without announcing that it is keeping it. Over time, the ledger tips, not dramatically, not with any single decisive moment, but gradually and without appeal. Reaching out begins to register as a form of risk. The return is not guaranteed, and for a generation already carrying the firm belief that self-reliance is more dependable than relying on others, that registration has consequences. The withdrawal that follows is not anger, it is not bitterness. Most of the time, it is a quiet recalibration, a return to the position that always felt safest, the one that requires nothing from anyone else and therefore cannot be let down by anyone else. From the outside it reads as indifference. From the inside it feels considerably more like protection. What the people closest to them often misread is the appearance of contentment. He seems fine. She keeps herself busy. They don't seem to need more than they have, and that appearance gets taken at face value. But seeming fine is a skill this generation developed early and practiced for decades without thinking of it as a skill at all. The appearance of contentment and the actual experience of connection are not the same thing, and the distance between them is exactly where the quiet loneliness lives. Not dramatic, not a crisis, but steady and real, and almost entirely unspoken. There is a particular kind of loneliness that belongs to this chapter of life specifically, and it is different from anything that came before it. It is not the loneliness of being new somewhere, of not yet having found the right people. It is the loneliness of having genuinely had your people for decades, through the most formative years of adult life, and watching the circumstances that held you together dissolve, one by one, until the distance between you is no longer geography or schedule, but something harder to name and harder to cross. Friends who moved, friends who got sick, friends who drifted when the shared structure disappeared, and neither person quite knew how to reach across the space that replaced it. What makes this loneliness so difficult to address is that addressing it requires precisely the behaviors this generation was most thoroughly conditioned to avoid. It requires admitting to yourself, and possibly to someone else, that you want more connection than you currently have. It requires initiating without a guarantee of response. It requires being willing to be the one who reaches first, who cares more visibly, who places something genuine on the table without knowing if it will be received. For someone who spent decades being the capable one, the reliable one, the person others came to rather than the person who asked, that particular reversal is genuinely difficult, not impossible, but difficult in a way that goes deeper than habit or social awkwardness. It touches something near the foundation of how they understand themselves. The independence that carried this generation through economic instability, through family upheaval, through decades of showing up and managing things without complaint, that same independence became, quietly and without any deliberate decision, the wall standing between them and the closeness they most want to hold on to. That is worth sitting with for a moment, because it is not a character flaw, it is not a failure. It is the entirely predictable outcome of conditions that built something real and lasting, the steadiness, the reliability, the capacity to carry difficulty without collapsing. That was not nothing. For decades it was everything. The cost only became visible later, in the chapters when the structures that had made connection effortless were gone, and what remained required a different kind of courage than the one so carefully built. Seeing that clearly, the strength and the shadow together is not a defeat. It is simply an honest accounting. Bulbant, if there is a name that gets scrolled past, if there is a friendship that gets thought about, but not quite reached for, if there is someone missed in the quiet, unhurried way that this generation tends to carry missing, privately, without announcement, it may be worth knowing that the hesitation is not a verdict on the friendship. It is the echo of something learned long ago, in a world that no longer exists, still running its old program in a life that has moved well beyond it. You don't need a reason to call. The missing them has always been reason enough. If something in this video felt familiar, whether it described your own experience or someone you love, leave a comment below. These conversations matter more than they might appear to. And if you want to keep exploring the quieter psychological patterns of this generation, subscribe. There is much more worth saying.